Peter Blair Henry is the Richard R. West Dean of New York University's Leonard N. Stern School of Business, assuming the deanship in January 2010, and joined the NYU Stern faculty as the William R. Berkeley Professor of Economics and Finance. Henry joined NYU Stern from Stanford University, where he was a professor of international economics, a faculty scholar, and associate director of the Center for Global Business and the Economy. As an expert on the global economy, Henry led the External Economics Advisory Group for then-Senator Barack Obama in his US presidential campaign in 2008. Following this historic victory on November 4th, Henry was chosen to lead the Presidential Transition Team's review of international lending agencies such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And in June 2009, President Obama appointed him to the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. Henry's expertise in the areas of emerging markets and international finance has made him a regular speaker at the IMF and has led him to testify before the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and before various ambassadors to the United Nations. Additionally, Henry has served as a macroeconomic advisor to the governments of Ghana and Jamaica. The author of numerous articles and book chapters, Henry is best known for a series of publications in the 3 flagship journals of the American Economic Association that overturn conventional wisdom on the topics of debt relief, international capital flows, and the role of institutions in economic growth. Dean Henry received his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. While in graduate school, he served as a consultant to the governors of the Bank of Jamaica and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Prior to attending MIT, Henry was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he received a BA in mathematics. He also holds a BA in economics with distinction and highest honors from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His first book, Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth, directly addresses such issues of economic efficiency as well as matters of international relations. In it, Henry argues that the secret to emerging countries' success, and to the future prosperity of the developed world as well, is discipline, a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy. In many ways, Turnaround is an extension of Henry's very first lesson in international economics, which he received at the age of 8 as his family moved from the Caribbean island of Jamaica to affluent Willamette, Illinois. The elusive answer to the question of why the average standard of living can be so different from one country to another still drives him today. And for those interested in purchasing Dean Henry's book, the book is available on Amazon, and it will also be available very soon at the NYUAD bookstore. So please join me in welcoming Dean Peter Blair Henry.
Thank you, Jason, for that kind introduction. You know, every time I hear that kind of long, kind of humbling bio, it reminds me why I didn't have a lot of friends growing up as a kid. But as I like to tell people, it's okay, because now that I'm actually dean of a business school, I have many, many friends, especially around the time of admissions. But with all seriousness, it's great to be back in Abu Dhabi. It's great to see Al and Fabio and other members of the team. I remember first coming to Abu Dhabi in December of 2009 when I was just dean-elect of the Stern School, and being really impressed then at the vision and the energy. And also even then I got a chance to participate in the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute to see the Institute at work. Was impressed then, and I'm just extraordinarily gratified to have a chance to participate in this and be part of the intellectual community here. Really exciting what's going on. And I should mention on this past Sunday, my colleague Anna David, who's here in the front row, we were both at NYU Abu Dhabi and had a chance to interact with roughly 30 plus seniors who are thinking hard about what comes next for them. And so we had an opportunity privilege to talk to them about what's going on at Stern and try to encourage them to apply either now or at some point in the future. So anyway, just very exciting times, and it's a delight to be here. So I'm also in Abu Dhabi to participate in the World Economic Forum, which just concluded yesterday. And it's a really important moment in the global economy. We sit at a moment, and people often use this term inflection point. I think it's overly used, but it is a really critical moment. And that's really why I wrote Turnaround. We sit at a moment where, if you think about it, in 2007, the world experienced its highest growth rate, and particularly between 2002 and 2007. The world experienced its fastest ever 5-year period of economic growth. The world economy grew by 4.9%. And if you look at the forecast for this year, for 2013, the world economy is scheduled to grow at just 2.8%. So that's a dramatic decrease in the growth rate. If you look at advanced economies in particular, countries like the United States, Western Europe, Japan, the story is even more humbling. The United States is scheduled to grow at about 1.5% this year, which is far below what's called the long-run trend, or the average sustainable rate of growth in the United States. Europe is still largely in recession. I saw an article in the Financial Times about a month ago, kind of celebrating that there was 0.1% growth in Spain for the quarter. And you sort of know you're in an age of what I call diminished expectations when people are celebrating 0.1% growth. So the question is, how do we get back to driving prosperity? And also, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, growth matters because growth is about creating jobs, about creating employment. And employment matters because it's about creating dignity. And so what I want to do tonight is share with you some lessons that I've learned in the process of writing this book. Really 3 lessons that formerly third world countries that used to be called third world countries, and are now the emerging markets that have been driving the recovery, economic recovery, since 2008, such as it is. What lessons can we learn from these countries about what the world economy needs to do in order to reclaim prosperity, and specifically what advanced countries need to do to get back on track? And the big message that I want to share is that emerging markets, third world countries, don't prosper at the expense of first world countries or advanced nations. In a sense, a rising tide lifts all boats. So what's good for developing countries is good for us, and vice versa. And the real question is, will we all seize this future of shared prosperity, or will we be mired in this age of diminished expectations? So that's really the motivation. And so let me just tell you what those 3 lessons are. And then I want to share with you some stories that I think, A, illustrate why growth matters, why we care about these questions, and then some stories that just actually illustrate the principles I'm about to share with you at work. So the 3 lessons from the third world for the first world are the following. Third world countries turned themselves around, or the third world countries that turned themselves around and became the emerging markets that are driving global growth today, did so as a result of discipline, clarity, and trust. And as Jason said, discipline is a pragmatic growth strategy. Discipline is a commitment, a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy that values what's good for the country as a whole over what's good for any individual, interest group, or person running for political office. And let me just say, right now, before I go into any more details, discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. I hope Angela Merkel is listening. Discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. Discipline is not the same thing as a willingness to take extreme measures. Sometimes discipline requires extreme measures. But the way to think about discipline really is like good eating habits. It's neither binge eating or crash dieting. It's sustained, healthy eating habits over a lifetime. And I'll talk more about discipline. Second point, clarity. Countries that turned themselves around did so once their leaders demonstrated a clear commitment to a change of direction. Clarity is central in turnaround. And then trust. Trust is essential to human relationships, but it's also central to functioning market economies. Economies, the world of business, economic growth moves at the speed of trust. The arm's length relationships that are so critical to the function of a market economy require that citizens trust their governments, that businesses trust other businesses, and that nations trust each other. So I want to come back to those points. So discipline, clarity, and trust. But before I share with you the stories that illustrate these three principles at work in helping countries to turn around, what I want to do is just share a short excerpt from the book that I think really underscores why growth matters at all. Chapter 1, Miss Mama. Growing up as a little boy on the island of Jamaica in the early 1970s, I cherished the time I spent on the porch of my grandmother's simple two-bedroom ranch house in Kingston, the nation's capital. There, at 3 Windy Way in Harborview, a middle and working-class neighborhood at the southern edge of the city, I would sit on the brown speckled tile, leafing through the pages of Encyclopedia Britannica, reading Bible stories, and poring over back issues of National Geographic for hours on end. As sea breezes stirred the needles of the casuarina trees that lined the front yard and shaded my world from both the sun and the gazes of people passing by on the sidewalk, scents from Grandma's kitchen, pumpkin soup, baking bread, brown sugar, and lime juice wafted through the air. Things only got better as the day progressed, and the sun made its arc through the cobalt expanse of the Jamaican afternoon sky. The approach of evening was always my favorite stretch of time, a welcome pause between the heat of day and the fall of darkness. Grandma, finished with her cooking and housework, would come outside and sit with me in the early evening air. Encouraging children to read and dream was what Grandma, a former schoolteacher, did best, and she never missed an opportunity to work with one of her favorite students. Sitting together in the fading light, we lost ourselves in conversation, accompanied by the pulse of chirping crickets, the reverberating reggae beats from a nearby rum shop, and the animated voices of young men playing soccer in the street. These are the sounds of the Caribbean, the lyrical backdrop to Grandma's outdoor classroom, where I asked question after question about the people and places I had encountered in the day's reading, and my ever-patient teacher shared with me facts and figures about distant lands. Yet the greatest lesson I learned from my grandmother came not from something she read to me, but from something she did for someone else. In Jamaica, as in many developing countries, poverty is never far away. On one occasion, the ambient sounds of those Caribbean evenings gave way to the piercing call of a woman at the front gate. Mrs. Henry, you there, sir? Me beg you make me come in. When poverty calls to you from the front gate, you have to make a choice. You can avert your eyes, perhaps even turn your back and harden your resolve not to engage. But poverty will still be there looking at you, even if you don't have the courage to return its gaze. Soon come. Grandma called out as she lifted her tiny, slightly hunched frame from the chair next to me, walked across the tiles, stepped from porch to carport, and made the 30-foot journey to the gate. "Good evening, Miss Mama. How are you?" Miss Mama's appearance belied her reply. "Me all right so far, Mrs. Henry." Miss Mama looked anything but all right to me as I watched her follow Grandma toward the porch. The closer Miss Mama came to my sacred classroom, the sharper the contrast I discerned between her and my beloved tutor. With bare feet, tattered clothes, matted hair, and a protruding potbelly, seemingly at odds with her thin frame, Miss Mama appeared to be from an entirely different planet than my grandmother, who, with her pressed and starched cotton dress and neatly groomed appearance, was the quintessential schoolteacher and matron of the Anglican Church. After inviting Miss Mama to sit down next to her and across from me, Grandma asked Miss Mama if she was hungry. Miss Mama replied, "Yes, Mrs. Henry. It's a long time me not eat, ma'am." My grandmother disappeared inside, then emerged a few minutes later with a large tumbler of milk and a plate of warm, hard dough bread dripping with butter. I sat there, watching Miss Mama eat and listening to the exchange. My grandmother asking questions in the Queen's English, Miss Mama responding in patois. They continued on for some time, Miss Mama chronicling her tough circumstances, my grandmother offering words of comfort and encouragement, until the last crumbs disappeared from the plate. The milk was drained, and my grandmother sent Miss Mama on her way with the familiar Jamaican benediction, "Walk good." I don't know how Miss Mama got her name, and I don't know where she came from, but I can picture her today just as I saw her in that first encounter in late 1977 when I was 8 years old. Over the next several months, Miss Mama appeared at my grandmother's front gate with increasing frequency. One day in 1978, following what turned out to be the last time I saw Miss Mama, I asked my grandmother, "Grandma, Miss Mama has a big belly, so why is she always hungry?" My grandmother replied that some people have big bellies, not from eating too much, but because they never get enough to eat. For me, economics is all about Miss Mama. I was drawn to the subject because I wanted to help people in developing countries, like my native Jamaica, help themselves. Feeding the hungry is an act of kindness. Providing the hungry with the means to feed themselves is an act of empowerment that confers dignity as well as nourishment. My grandmother was too old and lacked the technical training to give people like Miss Mama that kind of enabling assistance. I wrote this book because I have no such excuse. Helping people to help themselves begins with a simple observation. Never in the history of the world has a country sustainably reduced poverty without significantly increasing its population's average overall standard of living. The gains from economic expansion may not be evenly distributed, so growth alone is not a sufficient condition for development. But it is absolutely necessary. Without growth, life becomes a series of zero-sum struggles directed at preserving one's share of limited resources. With growth, the pie expands, and the politics of distribution no longer involves such stark trade-offs. Because economic expansion provides the most reliable means of enabling the poor to lift themselves out of poverty, the critical question is, what kinds of economic policies lay the foundation for growth? The economic policy decisions implemented in the months and years ahead will determine whether people eat or starve, live or die, and not just in emerging economies. The financial crisis of 2008-2009 drove record numbers of people in the United States into unemployment, foreclosure, and poverty, to say nothing of the devastating impact of its aftershocks on the economies and people of Europe. Whether in the first world or the third, there's no place to hide from the power of policy. That's why discipline, clarity, and trust matter. So let's talk about discipline. If discipline doesn't mean fiscal austerity, and it means a sustained commitment to a long-term growth strategy, it still doesn't answer the question of how do we know what discipline really looks like in practice? And it's a difficult question because one person's discipline might be another person's indiscipline. And it really depends on many ways your answer to that question. For most people, where you come out ideologically, and the questions at hand are just far too important to be left to ideology. So there's been a long debate over what discipline means. And the debate over what discipline means, for instance, in the context of fiscal policy, goes all the way back, frankly, to the time of Miss Mama, if not before. But in particular, in the late 1970s, developing countries, then third world countries, were engaged in very heavy borrowing from the rest of the world, borrowing from commercial banks to try to finance economic development. And as a result, they got into deep trouble. The money they borrowed wasn't spent wisely. Banks became concerned about their ability to pay off those loans. And in August of 1982, August 12, 1982, Mexico, the Mexican government, called up the US Treasury and basically said, we can no longer pay our debt. And that triggered what was known as the third world debt crisis. Banks began to call on their loans, much like the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Loans dried up. Credit was hard to come by. Growth ground to a halt. And people became very worried that the world financial system was going to be taken under by this massive third world debts that could no longer be repaid. And so enter into this picture the United States Treasury. In particular, a gentleman named James A. Baker III, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, began to meet regularly with Paul Volcker, who was then chairman of the US Federal Reserve. And in early 1985, so fast forward 3 years, Volcker and Baker began to have a series of conversations about what they felt needed to be done to resolve this third world debt crisis. And in October of 1985, Secretary Baker went to Seoul, South Korea for the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And in those meetings, he unveiled a speech called A Program for Sustained Growth, quote unquote. And that program for sustained growth was, you guessed it, his view of what discipline meant in the context of a range of economic policies. And in that speech, Baker opined on fiscal policy, on free trade, said countries needed to be more open to trade. He opined on the role of the state in the economy, said there should be less of the state, not more of the state, and on and on and on. And basically, when Baker gave this speech on behalf of his boss, President Ronald Reagan, it was very clear that Baker was speaking also on behalf of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the basic message was, if countries want to grow and get out of the crisis, they need to follow the elements of this program for sustained growth. And very specifically, if countries want to receive money, funding, from the IMF and the World Bank, they need to change their ways. And you have to remember, in the late 1970s, in the early 1980s, the dispute over whether market-friendly policies or state-run economies was still largely raging. And it was largely raging, particularly in developing countries that were, in many cases, were newly independent countries, seeking to forge their own identity, not just economically, but politically, socially, to establish some sense of identity in the world. And here comes Baker Secretary of the US Treasury, unveiling this speech. And to put it mildly, the program for sustained growth was not well received. People in third world countries, everyone from people on the street to finance ministers, felt that this was a program that was really designed just to make sure that banks got repaid. And it wasn't in the interest of the people. And so a firestorm erupted. A firestorm erupted over whether discipline really meant what Baker said, or did it mean something else? Did it lie in the policies that countries had already been following? And Baker's speech over time came to be known as the Washington Consensus, quote unquote. What Washington felt countries needed to do to start growing. And the point of telling you that story is discipline can get confused with ideology. And so what I do in this book is I say, let's not ask what James Baker or anybody perhaps on the right thinks about what's good economic policy. But let's also not ask what anyone on the left thinks what's good economic policy. Let's look at how stock markets in the countries that implemented economic reforms starting in 1985, how did stock markets in these countries respond when their governments announced that they were changing economic policy, when they were deciding to reduce the fiscal deficit, to get rid of inflation, or to open the economy to free trade, or to privatize state-owned enterprises, move more generally in the direction of market-friendly reforms? How did the stock market react? The stock market is actually an independent arbiter. The stock market doesn't care whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning. The stock market only cares whether a policy change is likely to create or destroy value in the economy. Now you may say that's really a narrow measure of economic well-being. Isn't the stock market only really telling you what's good for the wealthy? Actually, the answer is no. The stock market, as it responds to economic policy, is telling us, are policies likely to generate growth that's likely also then to generate jobs? And in particular, the stock market goes up in response to a major policy announcement. It makes it cheaper for firms to raise capital. As it becomes cheaper for firms to raise capital, and people expect the economy to grow more strongly in the future as a result of a change in policy, firms begin to invest more. They build new factories, install new machines. And as they build new factories, install new machines, workers become more productive. And as workers become more productive, they become more attractive to other firms. And other firms try to hire them away. We call that an increase in labor demand. And so that drives up wages. And so the point is, good policies can generate a virtuous cycle of good effects. And this is all the stock market cares about. It doesn't care about ideology. And so it's not a place to end the conversation, but it's a good place to get us away from ideology and just to ask the question, what is efficient for economies? So that's the lens that I use throughout the book. So let me tell you what discipline then actually means. And let me tell you what discipline means specifically in the context of fiscal policy, because there's been a lot of debate about fiscal policy in the last 3 years. And I started off by saying fiscal policy, discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. How do I know that? How do I know that the switch in 2010 from a policy of stimulus in the context of Europe to a policy of extreme austerity, extreme fiscal consolidation under the European Fiscal Compact, how do I know that's undisciplined? Well, let's look at the countries that Baker opined to. Over the course of the 3 decades, from the 1970s, the 1980s, and 1990s, there were 81 countries, 81 developing countries that undertook fiscal austerity. And they undertook fiscal austerity almost exclusively under the auspices of a program from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And if you look at those 81 episodes of fiscal austerity, what you find is that 56 of those episodes took place in the midst of what economists would call moderate inflation. Now, moderate inflation means inflation below 40%. Now, that doesn't sound very moderate to you probably, but in places like Brazil in 1994, inflation at times was as high as 3,000% per year, hyperinflation. So when people like Stan Fisher and Bill Easterly have looked at this question, they said 40% really is a threshold that we can consider moderate inflation. So think about these 56 episodes of moderate inflation and 25 episodes of high inflation, inflation from 41% all the way up to 3,000% in the case of Brazil. So what do we see? What does the stock market tell us about whether fiscal austerity is a good or bad idea, depending on whether you have high or moderate inflation? It turns out that when inflation is really high, like the case of Brazil that I mentioned, when governments announce fiscal austerity in the midst of high inflation, the stock market soars. In the year leading up to the implementation of fiscal austerity, because the market has learned the government intends to put this program into effect, and so the market begins reacting today, the stock market goes up about 60% in real dollar terms, above and beyond it would have done over that period of time in the absence of that policy change. We call those abnormal returns. So 60% increase in valuation above and beyond what would normally have happened, just in the course of a year. What happens in the case of moderate inflation? It's almost a mirror image. The stock market plunges by about 30% over roughly the same window of time. So, what's the lesson? Well, it seems pretty clear to me. In a world today where inflation is running at less than 2% in Europe, about 2% in the United States, fiscal austerity is not the way to go. It's not a value-creating policy. If it doesn't create value in the midst of moderate inflation in the order of 18% or so, why would we expect extreme fiscal measures to create value in the context of inflation that's between 0 and 2%? Now, I want to be careful. I'm not saying that deficits don't matter. At some point, governments do have to run sustainable finances. But the key lesson, because again, think of what discipline means. Discipline means a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy that's vigilant and flexible. The speed with which we reduce the deficit can be moderated. So in particular, when you think about Europe's switch to extreme austerity in 2010 in the midst of recession, that was a very imprudent move. And we see the effects of that. This is part of the reason why Europe is having this prolonged, protracted recession. So discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. So then what does it actually mean? Well, I think there's a very simple story to tell. Discipline is no more complicated than the story of the ant and the grasshopper in Aesop's fables. Right? So I have 4 boys at home. I read a lot of bedtime stories. And I'll just remind you of Aesop's fable, the story of the ant and the grasshopper. So the ant, during the summertime, was extremely diligent. And fields were blooming with grain. The ant put away grain and corn so that in the wintertime, when times were lean, you would have something to eat. The grasshopper went on an eating binge and had a party and had nothing to eat when the winter came around. And my favorite story about fiscal discipline is a contrast between the United States, which I refer to as a first world grasshopper, and Chile, which I call a third world ant. So we all know the story of the US budget deficit, or maybe not, so I'll just remind you. In 1999, the United States ran a record fiscal surplus. And in 2000, we had another record fiscal surplus, about $236 billion. In 2001, there was an election. George W. Bush won that election. and declared that he was going to return the people's money. The fiscal surplus was the people's money. He was going to give it back to the people. So we got a major tax cut. A major tax cut, and then we experienced in the United States a series of shocks. We had 9/11, a series of wars, recession, and so we entered in a period of serial deficits because we didn't have a buffer. We didn't have a stock of fiscal savings that we could draw down because we'd given it back to the people. And I want to be very clear, I'm not making a partisan point here. Had Al Gore been elected president, we might have seen those fiscal surpluses disappear in the form of higher spending rather than lower taxes. But the point is, the United States did not save when times were good so that they would have something to rely on when times were lean. Chile, by contrast, former third world country. In 2006, Chile was also experiencing a boom. The price of copper was high, Chile's major export. The Chilean treasury at that time had about $6 billion in surplus. It swelled to over $30 billion in 2008 as copper prices continued to rise. And in 2008, the people of Chile took to the streets and burned Andres Velasco, the finance minister, in effigy. Why? They said, give us our money back. Give the people the money. But Velasco said, no, this is money for a rainy day. And he stuck with the policy of saving. Well, 2008, 2009, there was a financial crisis. And in the depths of the financial crisis in 2009, because Chile, third world ant, had saved, the Ministry of Finance was able to institute a $4 billion tax cut package to cushion the blow of the financial crisis to the poor and to stimulate the economy. That's fiscal discipline. Let me talk about clarity. So I said at the outset, countries turn themselves around once leaders demonstrate a clear commitment to a change of direction. The story I want to share with you here comes from a very small place, the country of Barbados. So you might say, well, what can you learn from a small country like Barbados? It's even smaller than the place that I come from, Jamaica. But actually, I think there's a lot to learn. So in 1992, Barbados was on the brink of financial ruin. The United States was in recession in the aftermath of the savings and loan crisis. The country was experiencing a credit crunch. So there was a slowdown in the US economy, and Barbados, being a small economy, heavily dependent on tourists, largely from North America, was deeply affected by this. And Barbados had also been pursuing a policy of what's called a fixed exchange rate. So basically the currency, the Barbadian dollar, had been fixed to the US dollar, 1.7 Barbadian dollars per US dollar. And this policy had been in place since the early 1970s. So the IMF goes to Barbados, examines their situation, and says, look, you're about to run out of foreign exchange reserves. You're about to run out of US dollars because your exchange rate, your currency is too expensive. Instead of it being 1.7 Barbadian dollars to the US dollar, it should be something like 2 or 2.2 Barbadian dollars to the US dollar. In other words, you need to make things more expensive for consumers. You need to make cornflakes, buying cornflakes, more expensive so people will buy less cornflakes from the United States and buy less automobiles. And then also make your vacations cheaper. So you'll get more export revenue. You'll get more tourists coming to the country. That'll generate dollars. That was the basic idea, to value your currency. But the leadership in Barbados said, you know, we're not so sure we like that idea. They said it with an accent that I can't imitate. They said, we don't like that idea because we fix our exchange rate to the US dollar because it helps us keep inflation down. if we change the exchange rate and make it more expensive to buy cornflakes and automobiles and other basic necessities, people are going to ask for wage increases. And if people start asking for wage increases, then employers are going to start increasing their prices of locally produced goods. And that's going to set off a spiral of inflation. We don't want to do that. But unlike in most cases where the IMF goes and tells a country to do something and the country doesn't like it, Barbados, the leadership of Barbados did something else. They proposed an alternative. And they said, you want us to devalue our currency because you want us to make our goods more competitive in world markets. The Ministry of Finance said, we can do that if we actually just get people to, if we just cut people's wages a little bit. It'll make our goods cheaper. Problem, of course, is nobody likes having their wages cut. So what did the government do? The Prime Minister, Erskine Sanford, convened three-party talks. He got the private sector, his colleagues in government, and the labor unions all to come to the table. And he just laid it out. He said, we have these two choices. We have, if you like, on one hand, Scylla, which is devaluing our currency. And you know the problems with that. And on the other hand, we have Charybdis. It's called a wage cut. We've got to do one or the other. It's up to you. And so by a very narrow margin, the workers assented to the wage cut. So the government went ahead with this policy. And in the fall of 1991, roughly 30,000 people took to the streets of Bridgetown, the capital of Barbados, protesting the wage cut. Now, 30,000 people may not sound like a lot, but there are only 250,000 people in Barbados. An eighth of the island, that's roughly the equivalent of 40 million people marching on Washington, protesting their wages being cut. So this is an economy, this is a country on the brink. A place where you can feel the fabric of society pulling at the seams. So what happens next is the key. The head of the labor unions, a gentleman by the name of Sir Leroy Trotman, who I met 3 years ago. Turns out there are actually a lot of knights in Barbados. I didn't know that. Sir Leroy Trotman, head of the labor unions, goes to his constituency and says, we have to reconvene the talks. We can't do this. Our country's coming apart at the seams. So he gets together with the Prime Minister and they reconvene the talks. And importantly, the private sector, the head of the private sector, heads of the private sector organizations come back to the table as well and they agree to do something. They say, okay, if the workers are willing to accept wage cuts, we will open up our books and we will agree to give future productivity, to give future wage increases on the basis of productivity gains. In other words, we will share the fruits of progress with the workers. And so the re-engagement of the private sector, allows these three-party talks to be successful. And as a result, the wage cut holds. The church actually had to get involved and mediate, but a wage cut holds. The stock market took off. And over the course of the next year, the Barbadian economy recovered actually quite quickly. For his troubles, in the election which followed, a few months later in the late 1992, Sanford and his party were thrown out of office. And Sanford's party did not return to power for 14 years. Sanford was never again Prime Minister of the country. When asked in an interview, was the price you paid too high a price? Sanford responded very simply and clearly, the price I paid was a small price to save the country. That's clarity. So I've talked about discipline, I've talked about clarity. let me spend just a few minutes tell you why I think trust is so critical. So, by pursuing disciplined policies with clarity, great clarity in many cases, a number of formerly third world countries turned themselves around and experienced tremendous growth. Between 1980 and 1994, and again, remember I told you about that period in the early 1980s was a period of tremendous crisis in developing countries, the third world debt crisis. Emerging markets grew by only 3.5% per year. Between 1995 and 2007, they grew at 5.5% per year. So a dramatic increase in their growth rates. And as a result of this turnaround, this dramatic increase in growth rates, today, if you look at the world economy, emerging markets account for roughly 50% of global GDP. And if you look at growth, not just the level of GDP, but how much GDP is increasing, emerging markets account for more than half of growth. And if you look at the biggest emerging economies, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they now account for 21.5% of global production. But if you look at their representation on the board of the International Monetary Fund, that institution that plays such a critical role in driving multilateral policy towards developing countries. Those countries, those BRICS that account for 21.5% of global GDP, only have 11.5% of the shares, the voting shares at the IMF. But if you turn to Europe, mired in recession, in many ways at this moment, the very image of indiscipline and lack of clarity, Europe accounts for 24.5% of global GDP, but an outsized 32.5% of the voting shares at the IMF and the World Bank. And so we have this tremendous tension, this lack of reciprocity, where countries that have become increasingly important in the world economy are underrepresented on the boards of the multilateral institutions that really set the agenda. And why does this matter? It matters because it undermines precisely trust. Trust matters in a domestic context. It matters that citizens need to trust their governments. But countries also need to trust each other, especially in a world in which we're so interdependent and so interconnected. Policies matter, but so do relationships. And in a world in which emerging economies continue to be marginalized from a point of view of representation on the bodies of these organizations, it makes them very reluctant to continue down the path of discipline and clarity, because frankly, discipline and clarity is really hard. And for politicians, leaders in countries, to continue down this road, which still is largely associated with the Baker brand, the Washington Consensus, they need to be able to say to their citizens, look, the world is changing. As we're rising in economic importance, we're also being recognized. But that's not happening. And as a result, instead, what we see is a move towards less cooperation and interdependence. So in particular, this past spring, the BRICS, who now have their own multilateral meetings, have moved to set up their own development bank called the BRICS Bank. Now you might say, what's wrong with that? Countries are emerging. Shouldn't they have their own institutions? I'm not saying that the BRICS shouldn't pursue their own interests. But it's the spirit that drove them to feel like they had to set up this bank because they're not being recognized. It's that spirit of the world is in a zero-sum mentality and we have to fight to hold on to our own that undermines the shared prosperity that we all seek. That's the point. And so we find ourselves in a place where we're either going to decide that we all want to prosper together, and we're going to recognize the changes that these countries have made, or we don't. In 2010, in South Korea, the G20 met. The central bank governors and finance ministers of the G20 all met and decided we should move ahead with reforming the IMF. We should move 2 of the 24 seats of the IMF board away from Europe towards the dynamic emerging economies to rebalance things. This approved reform has not yet been enacted because the United States Congress, and specifically the House Committee on Trade and Finance, chaired by John Campbell of California, have said, no, we have to consider, and there's some technical details here, the money that was set aside by the United States government in 2009 to provide emergency funding to the IMF should it need more money at that time, which many people thought it did or would, to fund emerging markets during the crisis. So $63 billion was set aside by the current US administration. And the President, the Treasury Secretary have said this $63 billion should just be used towards the increase in US capital that's needed to rebalance what are called the quotas in the IMF in order to allow us to do this shift of votes. And Congressman Campbell said, no, we have to consider this $63 billion in the context of the sequester. Money that had already been set aside. In other words, politics, ideology stands in the way of shared prosperity. So that's just one example. So trust matters. Trust matters a lot. Because frankly, right now, we've put ourselves in a place where advanced nations are underachieving. I mentioned earlier the growth rates in the United States that are nowhere near historical norms. Recession in Europe. And by the way, emerging economies need to continue to move forward. They need to continue with reforms in order to continue to drive prosperity. And so it's not as though emerging markets have arrived and are on the rise and advanced economies are falling. That's the zero-sum kind of mentality that we tend to see in the newspapers. But the point is, we need advanced economies to be disciplined and their leaders to demonstrate clarity, and emerging markets need to continue to do the same so that all boats can rise together. But the lack of trust that exists now between emerging economies and advanced economies is in many ways a major obstacle to us achieving that shared prosperity. So this lack of trust, what I call the trust deficit, is a critical issue. A critical issue. So let me just summarize and then take any questions you might have. Discipline, clarity, and trust are the 3 key lessons that third world countries in the process of turning themselves around and becoming emerging markets have to teach first world countries, advanced nations, about what they need to do in order to turn their economies around and regain prosperity. Discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. And we see lack of clarity in advanced economies because we have, for instance, in the United States, the Federal Reserve is pursuing what's called quantitative easing, or it used to be called easy money, loose monetary policy, but we have tight fiscal policy. So policy which on the one hand, from a monetary perspective is stimulating the economy, but fiscal policy that's contracting the economy. That's a lack of clarity. Same thing in Europe. Outright monetary transactions in the midst of fiscal consolidation. Again, a lack of clarity. So the big question is, will advanced nations have the humility to look beyond their shores and look back in history and look and say, oh, the lessons that we taught third world countries through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the United States Treasury, we've forgotten them. We need to relearn discipline and clarity and trust and restore trust between ourselves and emerging economies, not because trust is good manners, but because trust is good business. So, there you have it. Third world lessons for first world growth. Be happy to take any questions.
And Nicolás Izaguirre, who also has a lot of responsibility in this discipline that we have in Chile. But I was working particularly in the Innovation Council. And in the innovation, when you want to experiment, when you want to try new things, you need more clarity than discipline. And what happened in Chile, even though we are growing at 4%, we need to grow at 5.5% in order to become a developed nation within 20 years. We cannot do that because we don't have clarity. In my own view, as a professor of economics here at NYU Abu Dhabi, my own view is that this discipline undermines the clarity in our country. So I would like you to ask you, Peter, what do you think? To which extent these two principles, these two dimensions, can actually work against development?
Great question and great observations. First, let me just kind of underscore something really important that you said, and then I actually want to put the question back to you because I'd like to hear more about how you see them in conflict. You said Chile is doing well, but it needs to be even better, and that is the point, right? It's not that developing countries have arrived, but in order to go from 4% to 5.5%, to lift even more people out of poverty more quickly and achieve full potential, there's more work to be done. And it depends, depending on what country you're in, what needs to happen, whether it's labor market reform or more innovation or financial sector reform. But that's why emerging markets need to continue down this road, and why trust is so important in creating the space that leaders need to make the hard choices. But my question is, in what sense are discipline and clarity in conflict in Chile? Yeah, please.
Here in the audience, there are no one of the board of the Innovation Council because we have the president, the minister. So, and I'm going to be very honest and very frank. They were sitting, making these big decisions on where to invest. So create these Silicon Valleys in Chile, for instance, where to invest in agriculture, tourism. They have to make decisions. Those decisions were very similar to the so-called industrial policy. So you are going to commit as a country to invest money, tax revenues, into one particular industry. So that's going to create some people who are going to benefit a lot. And that's very complicated in a country like Chile and everywhere. So those decisions, they said, okay, no, we are a disciplined country. We cannot make those decisions. Mm-hmm. But in my sense, in order to innovate and experiment, you need to take these risks, to have these bold decisions. And I didn't see that in my boss, who was the former Minister of Finance at that time. Sorry, let me be fair with him. He was pushing for that. But Andrés Velasco, who was on the other side of the table, said, we need to keep this discipline. And, they are very interesting characters, and it was very interesting to see them arguing, both economists. So.
Yeah, so I don't see that as discipline and clarity being in conflict. I think there's a legitimate question as to what does discipline mean in the context of innovation policy? And I would argue that you want to be very careful about having the government pick the winners. I'm not saying there's not a role for government, but I think you can harness the market and incentivize the market to create, whether it's more incubation sites, more incentives for entrepreneurs. There are ways for the government to incentivize innovation without picking who the innovators should be. So I don't see discipline and clarity as being in conflict. I just think it's a matter of understanding what does discipline mean in the context of innovation. Yeah, so let me take so the first question is related to the BRICS and the volatility we saw this summer. So first thing I would say is that I don't consider the BRICS to be advanced countries. They're still in pretty early stages of development, particularly countries like China and India. So it's true there's been a slowdown. So this year, emerging markets are expected to only grow at 4.5% versus if you go back to the late 2000s, they were growing as much as 7% per year. So I think the big lesson we've learned, one of the big lessons we've learned is that there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly in the big emerging economies you mentioned, in terms of their financial systems. So there's still a lot of financial vulnerability. So India in particular, the new head of the central bank, Raghu Rajan, is focused very heavily on reforming the financial sector. And a lot of capital flowed to emerging markets over the last 3 years because of really low interest rates. And a lot of that went into debt financing. And one of the things I sort of pointed to make in the book is that discipline in the context of international capital flows means that countries should not be too reliant on debt and should try to reduce their vulnerability by attracting more equity flows. So basically, instead of just taking out a loan, they should encourage foreign direct investment or portfolio equity. And the volatility we saw this summer, when people expected the Fed to begin tapering off of their quantitative easing program, really had a big impact. What drove that volatility was the fact that there was so much debt, and that made countries very, very vulnerable as people began to reverse those capital flows in order to move money back to what they thought were going to be eventually higher interest rates in the United States. So, long answer, but the point is there's a lot of disciplined work left to be done in the financial sectors of the Brazils, Indias, and Chinas of the world. With respect to your second question about the IMF is often called into really difficult circumstances where countries are already in trouble. And I'm not defending everything the IMF does. I think the IMF has made a lot of mistakes. But I'll say to the IMF's credit, the IMF actually has learned quite a bit over its history and has become much more flexible in its lending policy. Now, does that mean the IMF is immune to political pressure to lend to governments that have strong, to whom the U.S. has very strong ties? No. As I said, the United States has an outsized influence at the IMF. The United States controls 17% of the voting shares at the IMF. And as I was mentioning earlier, the issue of IMF reform, the reason it hasn't gone through is that it's an 85% vote, 85% of favorable vote that's required to the IMF in order for that reform to go through. The U.S. holds 17% of the votes. So the U.S. effectively has veto power, right? So that just means the U.S. has a lot of influence on lending. And so the IMF, I think, does the best it can, but sometimes it's faced with very difficult circumstances.
There has been very strong political obstacles to the leadership, and they eventually have to give in to these political pressures. So is there any merit to the argument that there should be no weak opposition to the leadership so that it can facilitate growth, such as in China or Singapore?
Yeah, that's a very, so the question is, it's a lot easier to implement a clear change of direction when there's no political opposition, right? So let me say the following thing. If you get a benevolent dictator, you can drive a lot of positive change very quickly. But what happens if you don't get a benevolent dictator? So, I have my own views about democracy and freedom. I like living in a democracy. I like freedom. My own country, my home country of Jamaica, has been a democracy that's delivered actually very poor economic policies for a very long time. I talk about this in the book. But I, like most people from Jamaica, wouldn't trade our political freedom for anything. But a deeper answer to your question is, and I think this is a hopeful answer, there are many cases of countries, big, messy, ethnically heterogeneous democracies that actually have delivered turnaround. So there's the earlier reference to India. India is the world's largest democracy. A lot of work left to be done in India. But India, starting in 1986 with the reforms under Rajiv Gandhi, began to implement slightly more market-friendly policies and almost doubled its rate of growth under democracy. Brazil, in 1994, world's highest inflation rate. Again, Brazil conquered inflation, which was the key to creating more stability, and began embracing more market reforms. Was a democracy, first under Enrique Cardoso, and then under Lula. So Lula was a brilliant populist politician. He had a great populist message. It rattled the markets when he ran for election. But Lula ran on populism, but then governed on discipline when it came to economic policy. So for every benevolent dictator, I can show you a dictator that's not so good at running economic policy. And democracies can deliver good outcomes. But your questions are really important because right now, democracies in advanced nations are doing a really poor job. And our leaders are not delivering discipline or clarity. And so again, I wrote the book because I wanted to really make the point that we can get to yes. We look around the world, we see these third world countries that have done it. And I'd also point to Indonesia, which again has a lot of work left. It's a very fledgling democracy. But if you would have asked people in 1997, after the Asian crisis, when Suharto was thrown out of office, or thrown out of power, was never elected, would you have expected Indonesia to deliver roughly 10 to 15 years of strong economic growth? I don't think very many people would have taken that bet. So, and again, Indonesia's managed to do that as a democracy with all the problems of being a fledgling democracy, and a Muslim democracy at that. So I take these all to be very, very hopeful signs that that democracy can actually deliver, again, across a wide range of ethnic and/or religious backgrounds, can actually deliver good outcomes. And again, the key kind of common denominator amongst all these turnaround episodes is different policies. So for a country like South Korea, it was export-led growth. Brazil, the key was conquering inflation. India was really getting the government out of the way in terms of the licensing process and so on. But the common denominator is discipline, clarity, and trust. Common denominators are discipline, clarity, and trust.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, and they're connected to the previous two questions that were asked. And it's specifically concerning the word growth, and you're equating it to prosperity. My first question, and they're interlinked somewhat, so they're not different questions. The first question is, do you see limitations to growth, especially the paradigm of growth that the current economic paradigm sets up, which is every single country needs to grow sustainably forever? We don't have the resources in the environment to match, and obviously the implicit assumption is that goods and services can continually be traded, and there's an inherent limitation. So this is the first point. And the second point, which is connected to that, is the systemic and structural nature of this growth. When we take into account the nature of modern money and that it comes into existence as a debt, requiring it to be paid off with additional money, this is what sets the paradigm you mentioned with regards to the IMF and the World Bank, the pressure with regards to the countries to actually basically satisfy the commercial interests of each country's desire to grow, which is why when you gave the example of various third world countries, you'd be hard pushed to find any country that took a loan, whether the dictators were corrupt or not, that actually resulted in growth of the nature that actually helped. I mean, Jamaica's a classic example. Jamaica had a crisis when they deregulated their markets. A lot of the time, the local economy suffers as a result of the commercial interest that are inherently with the countries that hold the veto rights. I mean, and also, last point, what growth are we aiming for? You gave the example of the first world grasshopper. And if this is the leading example of growth, this is the most indebted country in the world, where 7,500 people own 75% of that nation's financial assets. So this growth is inherently polarizing. This growth is it's systemically unfeasible to continue. So what do you think about the advice of certain people who propose what we need is degrowth to change the nature of the money supply in and of itself so that the world can be preserved?
All right, so I'm going to do my best to remember your three-part question here. So the first question, I'm already struggling. So the first question was with respect to the limits to growth. Are there limits to growth? So that's a complicated question. In fact, I mentioned earlier being here for the World Economic Forum. I'm part of what's called a global agenda council called New Models of Growth, which is chaired by my colleague Mike Spence, one of our Nobel Prize winners at Stern, looking exactly at this question. How, do we need to think in new ways about growth, given increased concerns and very well-founded concerns about issues such as sustainability? So the answer there is more to come, but there are lots of committed, serious scholars who are thinking very hard about how do we take the lessons that we've learned that are critical to good economic management, to producing more economic growth, which is critical and necessary, as I alluded to earlier, to get us out of a zero-sum struggle kind of a world, because even though growth isn't the same thing as happiness, it does lift people out of poverty, and without growth you can't do that. But how do you do that even as we take it seriously into consideration the kinds of sustainability issues that you mentioned? And so people are working hard on that, and I think there's going to be more to say about that in the next year or so. But yes, there are limits to growth, and we do need to consider impact on the environment and so on. Second question, I think, is a little easier to address, which is, doesn't lending sort of just generate debt, and isn't that a problem? Well, borrowing is only a problem if you don't use the money wisely. The countries that I talked about earlier, like Brazil and Mexico, for a very long time, didn't use the money very wisely, and that's what led to the debt crisis. If you look at developing nations today, emerging economies, their debt ratios are actually quite low on average. They're running debt to GDP ratios about 30% of GDP on average. So a lot of countries actually have figured out how to be more prudent borrowers, how to make sure that the government is putting in place an economic environment that encourages basically profitable borrowing and lending. So lending in of itself is not a problem. The case of the IMF in Jamaica, as I said before, the IMF is often called into very difficult circumstances. So basically, the IMF is in the business of providing economic medicine, but it often, it often has to deal with countries that don't come to get medicine until they're desperately ill, when they should have been coming earlier for basic treatment. So, one of the things I talk about in turn is, what led Jamaica to the massive plunge that it had in the 1970s? It was largely the choices of the leader, Michael Manley at the time, who just made really bad decisions. And the IMF was then called in to help, but the country was already in deep, deep crisis. And your third point, remind me your third question. Yeah, so I guess I've answered it. So I know, so debt in and of itself is not a problem. But the key is making sure that borrowed money is used wisely.
Do you see the third world debt crisis
No, I think so. Africa. So I'm glad you mentioned Africa. Africa is a bright light at the moment. You know, Africa is for the first time in modern memory. You know, Africa's been growing strongly over the last decade. So African countries are scheduled to grow by about 5% this year, and you know, this sort of happens sort of relatively quietly. African countries, not all African countries, but many African countries, you know, Ghana is a great example, through structural adjustment, through reforms that were recommended by the IMF, and again, and this is not to undermine, turnaround is hard. So I said discipline is a long-term commitment, but it's precisely through discipline and clarity and generating greater trust of the international community and the local business community, much of Africa is now growing. And the key to Africa continuing to grow and to grow even faster is in fact continuing to embrace discipline, clarity, and trust. And it's precisely the need to embrace what you call this paradigm that requires more trust in the international community, and the need for advanced economies to, again, to recognize the advances that developing countries have made, so that leaders in places like Africa can say to their citizens, look, you know, not only have we delivered in the past, being recognized for this, and there's a greater openness and willingness to recognize the success that we're having, and use that as a carrot for continuing to move forward with the agenda that needs to happen in order to generate even faster growth.